My name is Eleanor Hartman. I am 58 years old, and 3 months ago, I found out that my husband of 29 years spent $2.3 million of my late father's money to buy his college girlfriend a mansion on the Connecticut shoreline. I didn't find out from him. I didn't find out from a friend, or a text message, or catching him in a lie at the dinner table. I found out because a bank compliance officer named Karen Ruiz called my cell phone on a Tuesday morning while I was standing in my kitchen in my robe and asked me to confirm a wire transfer I had never authorized from a trust account bearing my maiden name for a property I had never seen. If you had told me, even 6 months earlier, that my husband was capable of this, of forging my signature, of lying to my face for the better part of a year, of using my dead father's trust to build a love nest for a woman he hadn't seen since Ronald Reagan was president, I would have laughed at you. I would have told you that you didn't know Richard. I would have told you 29 years means something. But here is what I have learned. Betrayal does not usually arrive with fireworks and slammed doors. It arrives quietly, through paperwork. It arrives with a phone call from a stranger who is only doing her job, who has no idea she is about to hand you the thread that unravels your entire life. And once she did, I did not cry. Not that day. That day, I got dressed, I made a pot of coffee, and I called my father's old attorney, a woman named Judith Okafor who had drafted the trust that protected my inheritance 22 years ago with a level of foresight my father never fully explained to me while he was alive. What I am about to tell you is the story of how my husband tried to erase me quietly, and how the very documents he thought he'd outsmarted became the weapon that took away everything he had: his money, his freedom, and the mansion he built for another woman. Stay with me until the end, because the final twist involves a clause in my father's will that even I didn't know existed, and it changes absolutely everything. This is my story. Let me back up. 29 years ago, I married Richard Hartman in a small stone chapel outside Hartford, Connecticut, in front of 80 guests and my father, Walter Bennett, who cried through the entire ceremony despite insisting beforehand that he did not do that sort of thing. My father built his life from nothing. He started as a bricklayer in the 1960s, and by the time he died, he owned 4 commercial properties and a portfolio of investments that most people in our town had no idea existed. He was a quiet, careful man. He did not trust easily, and it took him almost a decade to fully trust Richard. Richard, for his part, was an architect. Talented, charming, the kind of man who remembered the names of waiters and sent thank-you notes after dinner parties. We met at a mutual friend's engagement party when I was 26, and within 18 months we were married. We built a life together in Fairfield County, a colonial-style home, 2 children, Sophie and Daniel, a golden retriever named Biscuit who lived to be 15, family vacations in Cape Cod every August. I want you to understand that I am not telling you this story because I think my marriage was perfect. No marriage is. We had our fights, our stretches of distance, the year after my breast cancer diagnosis, when Richard barely spoke to me because, he later admitted, he was terrified of losing me and didn't know how to say it. We survived that year. I thought surviving it had made us stronger. I was wrong about a great many things, but I was most wrong about that. The phone call came on a Tuesday in April, at 9:47 in the morning. I remember the time because I looked at the clock right after I hung up, trying to understand what had just happened to my life in the span of 4 minutes. Mrs. Hartman? This is Karen Ruiz from First Meridian Trust. I'm calling to confirm a scheduled disbursement from the Bennett Family Trust, account ending in 4471. We flagged it for a routine verification call because the amount exceeds our standard threshold. I told her she must have the wrong person. I didn't have any pending disbursements. My father's trust, the one that had been sitting quietly, generating modest interest, funding my mother's care before she passed, and occasionally helping with Sophie's tuition, hadn't moved in years, not without my direct signature. I have a request here, ma'am, submitted with your electronic signature and PIN verification, dated 11 days ago, for $2,300,000, designated for a real estate closing at 14 Gull Point Lane, Old Saybrook. I had never heard that address in my life. Mrs. Hartman, I need you to freeze that transfer, I said, and I was surprised by how calm my own voice sounded, because inside my chest something had gone very, very cold. I did not authorize this. I want it frozen immediately. There was a pause, the particular pause of someone checking a screen. I'm sorry, ma'am, but this transaction actually completed 9 days ago. The funds were disbursed on April the 3rd. I'm calling because there's a secondary authorization pending, a request to add a name to the deed as a co-owner, and that one requires a live verification call before we release it. That's actually why I'm speaking with you now. Whose name? I asked. Whose name is being added to the deed? She read it to me, and it meant absolutely nothing to me in that moment. Diana Cole. I did not know then that Diana Cole was a name I should have recognized. I did not know she was the reason Richard had once, a lifetime ago, taken almost 4 months to fully commit to our relationship. I did not know that 31 years earlier, before I ever met him, Richard had been engaged to a woman named Diana Cole, and that the engagement had ended not because he stopped loving her, but because her family moved to Seattle, and the timing, as he put it once in an offhand comment I barely remembered, just wasn't right. I found all of this out later. In that moment, on the phone with Karen Ruiz, all I knew was that someone had spent $2.3 million of my father's money, using my name, my signature, my PIN, on a house I had never seen, for a woman I had never met, and that whoever had done it was trying, right at this moment, to legally attach her name to that property. Please don't authorize anything, I told Karen Ruiz. Please. I need time. Of course, Mrs. Hartman. I'll flag the account for manual review. But I have to ask, do you want me to report this as suspected fraud? Because if this signature isn't yours, that's a federal matter. I looked down at my own hand, at my wedding ring, at the coffee mug Richard had given me for our 20th anniversary that said, "Still my favorite person," and I said the word that would end my marriage. Yes. Before I go further, I think it's worth taking a moment to tell you what our marriage actually looked like from the inside, because I've thought a great deal, in the months since, about how a life can look completely solid from every angle and still be hollow at its center. The way a tree can look healthy on the outside, while rot works quietly through its trunk. Richard and I were, by most outward measures, a success story. We hosted Thanksgiving every year for 11 people, sometimes more. We took the kids skiing in Vermont every February. We had a joint checking account we both contributed to and a habit, every Sunday evening, of sitting on the back porch with a glass of wine and going over the coming week together, his client meetings, my board commitments, whichever child needed a ride to which activity. It was, in the most literal sense, a partnership. I used to tell my friends that the secret to a long marriage was low drama and high communication. I said it at dinner parties. I said it to Sophie once, when she was going through a rough patch with a boyfriend in college, as though I had some special insight to offer. I cringe now thinking about how confidently I said it, how little I understood that communication can be an illusion two people build together without either one realizing it's hollow. Looking back, there were years, not just months, years, where Richard and I ran our household like two competent business partners rather than two people deeply known to each other. We coordinated. We didn't always connect. After my cancer diagnosis in 2019, something in me changed in ways I don't think I ever fully explained to him, and something in him changed too, in ways he apparently never explained to me either, except, as it turned out, to a woman 3 states away over email. I don't say any of this to excuse what Richard did. Nothing excuses forgery. Nothing excuses theft from a dead man's trust. But I think it's important, if you're watching this and recognizing pieces of your own marriage in what I'm describing, to understand that betrayal rarely erupts out of nowhere. It grows in the quiet places a marriage stops tending to. My mistake, and I call it a mistake, not a sin, because I think there's a difference, was assuming that because we were good at logistics, we were still good at intimacy. I didn't ask him if he was happy. I don't think, in hindsight, I asked myself if I was happy either. We were comfortable, and comfort, I have learned, is not the same thing as safety. I sat at my kitchen table for almost 2 hours after that call, not moving, while my coffee went cold beside me. The rational part of my mind kept trying to construct an innocent explanation. Maybe it was identity theft, a stranger, not Richard. Maybe there was a clerical error and the bank had the wrong account entirely. Maybe. But somewhere underneath the rational part, a quieter and much older part of me already knew. Because 6 months earlier, Richard had started taking calls in the garage. Because he'd renewed his passport without mentioning why. Because there had been 3 separate weekends in the last year when he told me he was checking on the Milford project and came home smelling like salt air when the Milford project was 30 miles inland. I did what any woman in my position would eventually do. I searched Diana Cole. It took 11 minutes to find her. A real estate agent's public bio from a decade-old listing mentioned her maiden name, Diana Cole, alongside a married name she'd apparently since dropped. A Facebook profile, mostly private, but with one visible photo, a woman my age, silver blonde hair, standing on a boat, tagged at a marina in Old Saybrook. And then, at the bottom of a genealogy forum post from 2019, someone researching old Hartford social clubs had written a single sentence that made my stomach drop clean through the floor. Richard Hartman and Diana Cole were engaged in 1994, prior to his marriage to Eleanor Bennett. I had never once, in 29 years, heard my husband speak the name Diana Cole. Not once. I called my sister, Margaret, who lives 2 towns over and has never in her life minced words with me. I read her the texts I'd found, because by then I had also gone through Richard's old email, the one he thought I didn't have the password to, the one he'd forgotten I'd helped him set up back when he didn't trust the cloud. There were 412 emails between Richard and a Gmail address belonging to Diana Cole, going back 14 months. I did not read all of them that day. I couldn't. But I read enough. I read the one where he called her the one thing I never got right. I read the one where he told her that seeing her again at his college reunion the previous spring had cracked something open in him that he thought had closed for good. I read the one, dated 7 weeks ago, where he wrote, "Don't worry about the money, D. It's handled. Eleanor won't even notice. The trust barely gets touched, and by the time anything shows up on paper, it'll already be yours. Eleanor won't even notice." 29 years, and my husband's plan for stealing $2.3 million from my father's memory hinged on the assumption that I was too distracted, too trusting, or too foolish to notice. Margaret was quiet on the phone for a long moment after I read her that line. And then she said the thing that I think, more than anything else, is what steadied my spine for the fight that was coming. "Ellie," she said, "your father built that trust with a woman who does not miss things. Call Judith. Call her today." Judith Okafor had been my father's attorney since 1998. She was a tall, precise woman with silver locks and reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain, and she had a habit of listening to an entire story without interrupting once, and then asking exactly one question that made you realize you'd been looking at the whole thing wrong. I sat across from her mahogany desk 2 days after the bank call, having barely slept, having not yet said a single word to Richard about what I knew. She listened to everything: the phone call, the emails, Diana Cole, the mansion on Gull Point Lane, without so much as adjusting her glasses. When I finished, she opened a drawer, pulled out a thick folder with my father's name on the tab, and set it on the desk between us like she'd been waiting 22 years to open it. "Eleanor," she said, "do you remember, when your father passed, that I told you the trust had some unusual language in it? And you said you trusted him and didn't need the details explained." I did remember. I had been so consumed by grief at the time, my father died 8 months after my mother, that I had signed what I needed to sign and asked Judith to simply manage things. I trusted my father. I trusted the process. I never imagined I would need to understand the fine print, because I never imagined my husband would try to steal from it. "There's a clause in here," Judith said, tapping the folder, "that your father insisted on, over my objections at the time, because I told him it was unusual and possibly unnecessary. He didn't care. He said, and I remember this exactly, Judith, I've watched too many good women get quietly robbed by men who smile at Thanksgiving. Put it in anyway. She turned the folder toward me and pointed to a paragraph on page 14, titled Section 9, Spendthrift and Fraud Protection Provision. Your father structured this as a spendthrift trust, she explained. That means the assets inside it are legally shielded from creditors, and this is the important part, from unauthorized third-party access, including access by a spouse, unless that access is executed with your explicit, notarized, in-person consent for each individual disbursement above $50,000. Not a general power of attorney. Not an old signature card. Each individual disbursement. My stomach turned over. I gave Richard power of attorney, I said slowly, during my cancer treatment. In 2019. When I couldn't always make it to appointments or sign paperwork myself. Judith nodded slowly, like she'd expected me to say exactly that. That POA, do you remember if it was general or specifically limited to medical and day-to-day financial matters? I didn't remember. I had signed it in a hospital gown, exhausted from a treatment cycle, trusting my husband implicitly, focused on staying alive for my children. I'll need to pull the original document, Judith said. But Eleanor, I want you to understand something important, and I want you to hear it clearly, because it matters more than anything else I'm about to tell you. Even if that POA was broadly worded, even if Richard believed, in good faith or bad, that it gave him authority, your father's trust has a provision that trumps it. It's called an redemption and forfeiture clause, and your father added it for exactly one reason. She turned to page 21 and read it aloud, slowly, letting every word land. In the event that any disbursement from this trust is obtained through fraudulent representation, forged authorization, or material deception of the beneficiary, the recipient of such disbursement, regardless of relation to the beneficiary, shall be deemed to have obtained said assets in bad faith, triggering immediate reversion of the full disbursed amount, plus accrued interest, plus any real or personal property purchased in whole or in part with said funds, to the trust corpus to be held for the sole and exclusive benefit of the beneficiary, Eleanor Bennett Hartman, or her lawful heirs. I sat there staring at her, trying to absorb what she was telling me. In plain English, Eleanor, Judith said, closing the folder gently, if Richard forged your signature or misused a limited power of attorney to pull $2.3 million out of your father's trust and used that money to buy a house, that house is not Diana Cole's. That house is not even legally Richard's. Under this clause, if we can prove fraud, that house is yours. All of it. Free and clear. And your father, God rest him, built that protection into this trust 22 years ago, specifically because he did not fully trust Richard Hartman with your future. I put my head in my hands and, for the first time since the phone call, I cried. Not from grief. From something closer to fury mixed with an overwhelming, aching gratitude toward a man who had died 4 years earlier and had somehow still been protecting me. What do I do now? I asked. Judith's answer was simple, and it was the first moment I truly understood what the coming months would require of me. Now, she said, we build a case. Quietly. Before Richard has any idea you know. I want to tell you honestly how hard the next 3 weeks were, because I think anyone watching this who has ever discovered a betrayal understands the particular cruelty of having to pretend you don't know, while the person across the table from you eats dinner and asks about your day. Judith's instructions were precise. Say nothing. Change nothing about my daily routine. Do not confront Richard, do not tip him off, do not give him any reason to move money, destroy documents, or worse, disappear entirely before we had everything documented. In the meantime, she filed an emergency notice with First Meridian Trust formally disputing the transaction and requesting a full forensic audit of every disbursement from the Bennett Trust over the past 18 months. Karen Ruiz, to her enormous credit, had already flagged the account and frozen the pending deed transfer, which meant Diana Cole's name had never actually made it onto the title. Small mercy. It meant the clock was still, technically, on our side. I hired a private investigator named Thomas Reyes, a retired state police detective Judith had worked with for over a decade, and I gave him one job: document everything. The trips, the emails, the financial trail. Every dollar Richard had moved and where it had gone. Meanwhile, I sat across from my husband every night. He talked about a big client dinner in Old Saybrook that had run long. He talked about wanting to take a weekend trip to clear his head and check on some property he was considering as an investment. He kissed me on the forehead before bed the way he had for 29 years, and I lay next to him afterward with my eyes open in the dark, thinking about a house on Gold Point Lane that I had, by then, driven past exactly once. I want to describe that house to you, because seeing it changed something in me. It was enormous. White clapboard, black shutters, a wraparound porch facing the water, the kind of property that runs $4 to $5 million fully built. Though Richard's contribution had covered what the investigator later confirmed was the down payment and the bulk of the interior renovation, new kitchen, custom millwork, an entire wing added for what appeared, from permit filings, to be a home studio. Diana Cole, it turned out, was a semi-retired interior designer, and the house was, in a way, both a gift and a shared project. A future. I sat in my car across the street for 11 minutes. I did not go in. I did not confront anyone. I simply looked at the house my husband had built for another woman with my dead father's money, and I made myself a promise. I was not going to lose this quietly. Sophie, my daughter, called me during that period, the way she did every Sunday, and I nearly broke and told her everything 3 separate times. I didn't. Not because I didn't trust her, but because Judith had been clear: the fewer people who knew before the legal groundwork was solid, the less risk of Richard finding out early. It was one of the loneliest stretches of my life, carrying a secret that large, that devastating, entirely alone, while smiling at my own family across a dinner table set with dishes my mother had given us as a wedding gift. Thomas Reyes came back to Judith's office 3.5 weeks after the phone call with a folder that made even Judith, a woman who had seen decades of ugly divorces, go quiet for a full minute before she spoke. Richard hadn't just forged a single transaction. Over 14 months, using a limited medical power of attorney that had technically expired in 2020, a full year before the first fraudulent transfer, he had made 6 separate withdrawals from the Bennett Trust, totaling $2.3 million, funneling each one through a shell account he'd opened under a slightly misspelled version of his own name, Richard Hartman with 2 N's, before finally wiring the full amount to the escrow company handling the Gold Point Lane purchase. He had used an expired document. He had opened a fraudulent account. He had forged, according to a handwriting analyst Judith brought in, my signature on no fewer than 9 separate authorization forms. This was not a moment of weakness. This was not a man swept up in an emotional affair who made one terrible decision. This was 14 months of careful, deliberate, criminal planning. And I still had to sit across from him at dinner and ask how his day was. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from performing normalcy while carrying knowledge that big. I remember one Tuesday evening during that stretch, about 2.5 weeks in, when Richard came home in an unusually good mood, humming to himself as he hung up his coat, and told me he wanted to take me to our anniversary dinner a few weeks early, just because. He suggested the restaurant where we'd had our first date, 29 years earlier, a small Italian place in West Hartford that had somehow survived every recession and trend since. I said yes. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I still don't fully understand my own choice in that instant. Some part of me, I think, wanted one more evening of the marriage I believed I'd had, even knowing it was already gone, the way you might visit a house one last time after you know you're moving, just to remember what the light looked like in the afternoon. We sat at a corner table. He ordered the same bottle of wine he'd ordered on our first date, a detail he was proud to have remembered, and I watched him tell the same old story to our waiter, a young man who couldn't have cared less, but smiled politely anyway, about how he knew, the moment he saw me across that restaurant in 1994, exactly what wine to order because I'd mentioned liking a Barolo earlier that week. It was a sweet story. It had always been one of my favorite stories about us. I sat there with that story, and with the knowledge, sitting like a stone in my chest, that this same man had been writing love letters to a different woman entirely, using a shell account with a misspelled version of his own name, while telling me I wouldn't even notice. I smiled through the whole dinner. I ordered the branzino. I let him hold my hand across the table on the walk back to the car. I tell you this not because it's a dramatic scene, but because I think it captures something true about betrayal that people don't talk about enough. It doesn't just steal your future. For a while, it makes you doubt your own past too, makes you replay every warm memory wondering which parts were real and which parts were simply performance you hadn't yet learned to recognize. It took me months, honestly, to be able to think about that anniversary dinner or any dinner before it, without immediately wondering what lie was sitting quietly underneath the tablecloth the whole time. I didn't have the luxury of falling apart, though, not yet. Judith had been clear that the weeks ahead required precision, not emotion, and so every night after Richard fell asleep, I sat in the guest bathroom with the fan running so he wouldn't hear, and I let myself cry exactly as much as I needed to. And then I washed my face, and I went back to bed, and in the morning I asked him how he'd slept. I made the decision to tell Sophie and Daniel exactly 1 week before Judith, and I planned to move forward legally, because I could not, in good conscience, let them find out from a courtroom filing or, worse, from Richard's version of events first. Sophie, 32, a labor and delivery nurse in Boston, drove down the same afternoon I called her. Daniel, 29, was harder to reach. He was finishing a work trip in Denver, but he called within the hour, his voice tight in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. I told them everything, sitting at that same kitchen table where I'd once sat frozen after the bank call. The trust. The mansion. Diana Cole. The forged signatures. I watched 2 grown adults, my children, go through something that looked almost exactly like the stages of grief, because in a real way, that's what it was. Grief for the version of their father they thought they knew. Sophie cried first, and then got angry, in that order, which I think is the healthier order, honestly. 14 months, Mom? He was doing this while we were at Thanksgiving. While we did the 4th of July at the lake house. He sat there and ate ate the food that came from Grandpa's money, while he was stealing it. Daniel was quieter, which worried me more. He asked precise, careful questions: how much money, what evidence, what Judith's plan was, the same instinct for control I recognized in myself. And then, near the end of the conversation, he said something that I still think about. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Did you ever suspect? Before the bank called? I told him the truth. That there had been small things, the garage phone calls, the unexplained trips, that I had noticed and, without fully admitting it to myself, chosen not to examine too closely because the alternative was too painful to consider. I told him that I understood now that my own instinct to look away, even briefly, was something I needed to sit with honestly, not to blame myself, but to understand. That's not on you, Daniel said. That's on him. You built a life assuming he was who he said he was. That's not naivety, Mom. That's just what trust is supposed to look like. Both of my children, to my enormous relief and gratitude, made the same decision independently. They were with me. Not in a performative way, not out of obligation, but because when they looked at the evidence, at the forged signatures and the expired power of attorney and the 14 months of secret emails, they saw exactly what I saw. A calculated betrayal, not a marriage that had simply drifted. Sophie asked if she could be the one to tell Richard's mother, Eleanor's mother-in-law of 29 years, Patricia, who was 83 and living in an assisted living facility in West Hartford, and who Sophie had always been close to. I told her that could wait. Everything, for 1 more week, needed to wait. Because the following Monday, Judith Okafor was filing. I want to be honest with you about how the confrontation happened, because it was not the dramatic scene you might be imagining. There was no thrown wine glass, no screaming match in the driveway. It was, in its own way, worse than that, because it was quiet, and it was final. Judith's plan required one thing from me that I dreaded more than anything else in this entire process: I had to be the one to tell Richard, face to face, before the legal filing went in. Both because Connecticut law required a good faith attempt at direct notice in certain fraud actions involving marital assets, and because Judith believed, correctly, as it turned out, that Richard's reaction in that unguarded moment would tell us everything we needed to know about how ugly this was about to get. I asked him to sit down at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening. Sophie and Daniel were both there, in the next room, at my request, not to ambush him, but because I did not want to be alone in that house with him once he understood what I knew. I did not raise my voice. I laid out 4 documents on the table between us: the bank's fraud notification, the handwriting analyst's report, a printed email, the one where he wrote "Eleanor won't even notice," and a copy of Section 9 of my father's trust. I watched my husband of 29 years go through every stage of a man who has been caught, in real time, across a kitchen table. First, he tried denial. "Eleanor, I don't know what you think you're looking at, but..." I slid the handwriting report closer to him. He stopped talking. Then he tried minimization. "It's not what it looks like. Diana and it's complicated, we reconnected, and yes, I helped her with the house, but I was always going to pay it back. I just needed time to move some things around before you." "Before I noticed," I said. "That's the phrase you used in your email." "Before I noticed." He went pale. He hadn't known I'd seen the emails. Then, and this is the part that I think surprised even Judith when I recounted it to her later, he tried something almost worse than denial. He tried to make it my fault. "You've been distant for years, Eleanor. Ever since the cancer, ever since the kids left, you buried yourself in that garden club and those charity boards, and I felt invisible in my own house. Diana made me feel like I mattered again. Can you honestly tell me you don't understand how that happens?" I looked at this man, a man I had nursed through his own father's death, a man whose late nights at the hospital I had sat through during my chemotherapy, a man I had built an entire life with, and I felt something inside me go very still and very clear. "Richard," I said, "I can understand loneliness. I can understand a marriage going through hard years. What I cannot understand, and what I will never accept, is that somewhere inside that loneliness, you decided the solution was to forge my signature 9 times and steal $2.3 million from my father's grave to build another woman a house. You didn't fall in love, Richard. You committed fraud. Those are not the same thing, and I will not let you tell our children they are the same thing." He didn't have an answer for that. He sat there, staring at the documents, and I think, for the first time in 14 months, he understood that this was not going to be quietly resolved with an apology and a promise to fix it. "I want a divorce," I said. "And I want my father's money back. All of it. And Richard, I need you to understand this clearly, because Judith has been very precise about it. That house is not going to be yours or Diana's. Under my father's trust, it already, legally, belongs to me." He laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "That's insane. That's not how trusts work, Eleanor. You can't just..." "I'd read Section 9 before you say anything else you'll regret," I said, and slid my father's trust document the rest of the way across the table. I watched him read it. I watched the exact moment he understood, and something in his face changed, not to remorse, but to something colder. Calculation. The look of a man realizing he was no longer just facing an angry wife. He was facing a legal reckoning his own father-in-law had built, brick by brick, 22 years before this moment, specifically to protect his daughter from exactly this kind of man. "You're going to regret this," he said quietly, and I remember thinking, even in that moment, how strange it was that those were the words he chose. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I'll fix it." A threat, dressed up as a warning. "No," I said, standing up from the table. "I don't think I am." Sophie and Daniel came out of the next room once they heard him leave for the guest bedroom that night. Richard didn't argue about sleeping arrangements, which told me something about how thoroughly the fight had already left him. Sophie hugged me first, tightly, without saying anything, and Daniel stood a little apart, arms crossed, staring down the hallway toward the guest room like he was still deciding whether to go say something to his father that he might regret. I told him not to, not that night. There would be time, if he wanted it, for that conversation later, on his own terms, when he wasn't running on adrenaline and grief. I didn't sleep much that night either. I lay in the bed we'd shared for over 2 decades, alone for the first time in a house that suddenly felt enormous and unfamiliar, and I thought about my father, and about Judith's calm voice reading Section 9 aloud in her office, and about how strange it was that the worst night of my marriage was also, somehow, the night I felt most certain I was going to be all right. I did not go looking for a confrontation with Diana Cole. I want to be clear about that because I think it would have been easy, in the heat of everything, to make her the villain of the story, to drive to that beautiful house on Gold Point Lane and demand answers. I resisted that instinct, largely because Judith advised strongly against any direct contact that could complicate the fraud case, but also because, if I am honest, some part of me was curious, not angry, when it came to Diana. She reached out to me first, 12 days after the confrontation with Richard, through an email that Thomas Reyes, my investigator, confirmed was genuinely from her and not some maneuver of Richard's. Mrs. Hartman, she wrote, I don't expect you to believe me, and I understand if you delete this without reading further. But I need you to know that I did not know where the money for this house came from. Richard told me it was an inheritance from an uncle, fully his to spend. I found out 3 days ago, when a woman named Karen Ruiz called this house asking questions about a trust with your maiden name on it, that he lied to me the same way, I suspect, he lied to you. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am telling you because I think, whatever else is true, you deserve to know that I was not a willing party to fraud, even if I was a willing party to an affair, and I am ashamed of both. I sat with that email for a long time before responding. Judith read it too, and confirmed that, if true, it actually strengthened our case rather than complicating it, because it meant Richard had committed a second layer of deception, lying not only to me but to Diana, forging a narrative of clean, inherited money to get her to agree to put her name on the deed. I never met Diana Cole in person. I never felt the need to. But I responded to her email with one sentence, because I found, to my own surprise, that I meant it. I believe you, and I hope you get your own answers from him, because I certainly never did. The forensic accountant Judith brought in eventually confirmed what Diana's email suggested. Richard had told Diana the money came from a fictional uncle's estate. He had told his own children nothing at all. He had told me it was handled, and that I wouldn't even notice. 3 different lies, 3 different audiences, one very simple truth underneath all of them. Richard Hartman did not think anyone in his life deserved the truth. Diana ended up selling her half-interest, such as it was, given the deed transfer had never completed, and moved out of the Gold Point Lane house within 6 weeks, cooperating fully with the fraud investigation once it became clear that her name, too, could be legally entangled in a federal wire fraud case if she wasn't careful. I don't know what became of her relationship with Richard after that. I genuinely never asked. Judith filed 2 separate actions on the same Monday morning. The first was a civil action against Richard directly, invoking Section 9 of the Bennett Trust, seeking immediate reversion of the full $2.3 million, plus interest, plus the Gold Point Lane property itself, now legally classified as an asset purchased in whole or in part with fraudulently obtained trust funds. The second, filed jointly with First Meridian Trust's own legal department, was a formal fraud referral to the Connecticut Attorney General's office and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Because interstate wire transfers involving forged signatures and an expired power of attorney crossed from civil dispute into genuine federal fraud territory the moment Karen Ruiz's compliance team confirmed the forged notarizations. I want to pause here and say something to anyone watching this who is currently living through their own version of financial betrayal, because I think it matters. I did not want any of this to become a criminal matter. Some part of me, even after everything, still hoped this could be resolved as a painful but private divorce. But Judith explained something to me that I think about often. She said, Eleanor, the moment he forged your signature, this stopped being a marital dispute and became a crime. You are not choosing to punish him. The law already made that choice the day he picked up a pen and signed your name. Richard hired an attorney of his own, a sharp litigator named Preston Vance, who tried, in the opening weeks, to argue that the 2019 power of attorney, even though expired, established a reasonable and long-standing pattern of financial authority that Richard believed, in good faith, extended to the trust. It was, Judith told me privately, a weak argument, the kind of thing you argue when you don't actually have an argument, but it delayed things by nearly 2 months while both sides deposed witnesses. I sat through my own deposition in June, in a conference room with too much fluorescent light, answering questions from Preston Vance for nearly 5 hours about my marriage, my medical history, the extent of my involvement in our household finances. It was exhausting and, at points, humiliating in the specific way legal proceedings are designed to be, testing whether grief and betrayal can survive being reduced to timestamps and exhibit numbers. But the handwriting analysis was unambiguous. The bank's own internal fraud team, embarrassed at having processed 9 forged notarizations without catching them, cooperated fully once the FBI became involved, providing every internal document showing the pattern of withdrawals and the shell account under the misspelled name. And Diana Cole's testimony, given voluntarily and without a subpoena, confirmed Richard had lied to both of us independently, which Judith later told me was the single most damaging piece of testimony in the entire case, because it destroyed any argument that this was a good-faith misunderstanding rather than deliberate, sustained deception. In August, 4 months after the phone call that started everything, Preston Vance called Judith with an offer. Richard would concede the fraud claim entirely, in exchange for the criminal referral being dropped or, at minimum, for Richard's cooperation being taken into account by prosecutors. I sat in Judith's office when she relayed the offer to me, and she asked me a question I had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. "Eleanor, this is your decision and only yours. Do you want to pursue jail time, or do you want to take the full civil recovery and let the criminal side proceed at the state's own pace, separate from your negotiations?" I thought about my father, who built that trust brick by brick out of a lifetime of distrust he'd earned through hard experience. I thought about my children, who deserve to move forward without years of criminal trial hanging over every holiday. And I thought about myself and what I actually wanted underneath the anger. "I don't want revenge for the sake of revenge," I told Judith. "I want what's mine back. I want the truth on the record, permanently, so no one, not Richard, not his mother, not anyone in this town, can ever say I made this up or overreacted. And I want him to face whatever consequences the law decides are fair, on its own timeline, without me negotiating it away like it's a bargaining chip." Judith nodded slowly, and I remember she said, "Your father would be proud of that answer." We accepted the civil settlement on our terms, not Richard's full reversion of the trust funds, full title to the Gull Point Lane property transferred into my name alone, and a public consent judgment, meaning the fraud finding would be a matter of permanent legal record, not sealed, not settled quietly. The criminal referral proceeded independently, as its own process, entirely outside my control, exactly as I wanted it. I drove out to Gull Point Lane alone, on a warm afternoon in early September, holding the keys that had, 3 days earlier, been formally, legally, transferred into my name. I want to describe what it felt like to walk through that house for the first time, because I think it surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire ordeal. I expected fury. I expected to walk through those rooms and see nothing but betrayal in every custom light fixture, every piece of reclaimed barnwood Diana Cole had chosen for the kitchen island, every dollar of my father's legacy poured into walls that were never supposed to be mine. Instead, I stood in the entryway, sunlight pouring through a wall of windows facing the water, and I felt something closer to grief. Not for my marriage, that grief had already mostly moved through me by then, worn smooth like a stone in a river. This was a quieter grief, for the version of this moment I'd once imagined, decades ago, when Richard and I used to talk about someday a house near the water, someday when the kids were grown, someday when we could slow down together. I sat down on the bottom step of that beautiful, stolen staircase, and I let myself cry for a long time. Not because I wanted the house. Not because I wanted Richard back. But because 29 years of a life I had believed in had ended, and even with every legal victory in the world, that particular grief needed its own moment, uninterrupted by lawyers or forensic accountants or the satisfaction of having one. When I was done, I stood up, and I made a decision that I think would have made my father laugh out loud with pride. I was not going to live in that house. It would always, no matter how thoroughly renovated, carry the shape of what it was built for. But I was also not going to let it simply be sold off and forgotten, as though none of this had happened. I called Sophie and Daniel and told them my plan, and both of them, independently, told me it was exactly right. I put the house on the market 4 weeks later, and when it sold, for slightly more than Richard had originally spent on it, thanks to a strong coastal real estate market that year, I did not keep the proceeds for myself. I established the Walter Bennett Memorial Trust for Women in Financial Recovery, a foundation providing free legal consultations, forensic accounting support, and emergency housing assistance for women navigating exactly the kind of financial abuse I had survived. I seeded it with the full proceeds of the Gull Point Lane sale, and I asked Judith Okafor to sit on its board. There is a particular kind of justice in that decision that I don't think I could have designed on purpose. A house built with stolen inheritance money, meant to be a monument to betrayal, became instead the foundation of an organization that has, in the 18 months since, helped over 300 women identify and stop financial fraud within their own marriages before it went as far as mine did. My father built a trust to protect one daughter. In the end, without ever planning it that way, it grew into something that protects hundreds of daughters he never got to meet. I think about the walkthrough with a real estate agent before the sale, a brisk, kind woman named Patrice who had no idea about the story behind the house and simply treated it as another beautiful listing on a beautiful street. She kept pointing out details Diana Cole had clearly chosen with real care, the way the primary bedroom faced the sunrise instead of the more obvious water view, the hand-selected tile in the mudroom, a reading nook built into a bay window with cushions in a soft sage green. It was strange, walking through someone else's careful vision for a life, knowing that vision had been built entirely on a lie neither of us had chosen to tell. There was one room I lingered in longer than the others, a small study just off the entryway, empty except for built-in shelving, clearly meant to be an office. I stood there for a while imagining what might have been planned for that room. A place for Richard to work from home some mornings, maybe. A place for the two of them to sit together in the evenings the way, decades earlier, we used to sit together in our own small starter apartment before either of us had any money at all. I felt, standing in that empty room, less anger than I expected and more a kind of tired sorrow for how much energy, how much careful attention, had gone into building a future on a foundation that could never hold. When the sale finally closed, Patrice handed me a small gift, a local tradition apparently, a bottle of wine with a ribbon around the neck, congratulating me on such a beautiful investment property. I thanked her, and I did not correct her, and I drove home with that bottle of wine sitting untouched in my passenger seat for 3 days before I finally opened it, alone, on my own back porch, and drank a glass in a kind of private, quiet toast to the version of myself who had sat frozen at her kitchen table 5 months earlier, not yet knowing how much strength she still had left to find. I won't spend too long on this, because I've found, in the time since, that I genuinely don't think about Richard as often as people expect me to. The criminal case moved slower than the civil settlement, as these things often do. Richard was ultimately charged with 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of forgery under Connecticut state law, in addition to a federal charge related to the interstate nature of the wire transfers. His attorney negotiated a plea agreement, 18 months in a federal facility, 5 years of supervised probation, and a permanent restitution order, though by that point, the civil settlement had already recovered the actual funds and property. So the restitution order was, functionally, more symbolic than financial. He lost his architecture license during the proceedings, not because of the fraud charges directly, but because the Professional Licensing Board opened its own review once the forged notarizations became public record, and determined that a pattern of falsifying legal documents was incompatible with maintaining professional certification. His mother, Patricia, took the news hard. Sophie, true to her word, was the one who told her, gently, in the assisted living facility where she'd lived for the past several years. Patricia cried, and then, according to Sophie, said something that I think about often. I told him, 30 years ago, that Diana Cole was going to be the thing he regretted his whole life if he let her go the way he did. I just never imagined he'd spend 30 years finding a way to regret it even more. I have not spoken to Richard since the day the settlement was finalized. Sophie and Daniel maintain a careful, limited relationship with him, visits a few times a year, phone calls on birthdays, and I have never once asked them to choose a side, because that was never a fight I wanted them fighting on my behalf. That was between them and their father, and I trust them to navigate it with more grace than I sometimes feel capable of myself. I am 59 years old now. I sold the house Richard and I lived in for 26 years, not out of spite, but because it no longer felt like it belonged to the life I was building. I bought a smaller place, a converted carriage house 40 minutes from Sophie, with a garden I designed myself and a kitchen exactly the size I need it to be. I still run the Walter Bennett Memorial Trust 2 days a week. I've become, somewhat to my own surprise, a public speaker on financial literacy for women over 50, invited to speak at community centers and church groups, and, once, memorably, a state Senate hearing on elder financial abuse protections, where I read Section 9 of my father's trust out loud in front of a room full of legislators, and watched 3 of them start taking notes. I think often about the woman I was on that Tuesday morning in April, standing in my kitchen in my robe, hearing Karen Ruiz's voice for the first time. I think about how close I came to explaining it away, to trusting my own instinct to look the other direction the way I had, quietly, for months before that call. I think about how different my life would look right now if my father hadn't insisted, over his own attorney's objections, on a clause that most people would have called excessive, even paranoid, at the time he wrote it. He wasn't paranoid. He was right. And I have come to believe that the deepest form of love my father ever showed me wasn't the trust fund itself. It was the fact that he built protection into it for a betrayal he couldn't have specifically predicted, but somehow, in his bones, knew to guard against. I want to tell you about one more evening before I close this story, because I think it says more about where I've landed than anything else I could describe. It was a Sunday in late October, about a year after that first phone call from Karen Ruiz, and Sophie came over for dinner at my new house, the carriage house with the garden I'd designed myself. We sat on the back steps afterward, the way we used to when she was small, watching the last of the daylight fade over the hedges, and she asked me a question I hadn't quite expected. Do you ever regret not fighting for the marriage instead? Like, trying counseling or giving him a chance to make it right? It's a fair question, and I sat with it honestly before I answered, because I think anyone in my position owes themselves that kind of honest reckoning rather than a tidy, rehearsed answer for the cameras. I've thought about it, I told her. Not because I miss him, I don't, not really, not anymore. But because I spent 29 years believing that commitment meant staying through hard things, working through hard things, and some part of me wondered, early on, if walking away that fast meant I hadn't tried hard enough. And now? Now I understand there's a difference between a marriage going through a hard season and a marriage where one person has already decided, quietly, to build an entirely separate life while letting you believe you're still building the same one together. Counseling can fix a hard season, Soph. It cannot fix 9 forged signatures. Some decisions aren't invitations to rebuild. They're confessions that the rebuilding already happened, somewhere else, without you. She was quiet for a while after that, and then she leaned her head against my shoulder, the way she used to as a little girl, and said, "Grandpa would be so proud of you. Not just for winning. For how you did it. You didn't become him to beat him." That's the sentence I carry with me now, more than any court filing, more than the foundation, more than the framed letter on my wall. I didn't become him to beat him. I stayed exactly who I was, careful, deliberate, patient, the daughter of a bricklayer who built things slowly and built them to last, and it turned out that version of me was more than enough. I still believe in love. That might surprise some of you, given everything I've just told you, but I do. I believe in it more carefully now, with my eyes fully open, but I believe in it. I've started seeing someone recently, a widower named Frank who I met, of all places, at one of my financial literacy talks, where he'd come to support his own daughter navigating a difficult divorce. We take things slowly. We actually talk, about hard things, instead of simply coordinating logistics across a shared calendar. It's different this time, in ways I don't think I could have appreciated at 26, when I married Richard in that small stone chapel outside Hartford with my father crying in the front row. I know now what my father knew all along, watching me from that pew. Love is not the absence of protection. The truest love builds the protection in from the very beginning, quietly, patiently, hoping you'll never need it, but making sure, absolutely sure, that if you ever do, it will be there waiting for you. 22 years later. On an ordinary Tuesday morning, in the shape of a phone call from a stranger who has no idea she is about to save your life. I promised you, at the beginning of this story, a final twist, and I want to end with it because I think it says more about who my father was than anything else I could tell you. When Judith and I were finalizing the foundation paperwork, she pulled one more document from my father's original file, a private letter he had written and sealed, to be opened only in the event that Section 9 was ever actually triggered. He had written it the same year he drafted the trust, 22 years before any of this happened, and updated it once, 5 years before he died. In it, he wrote that he had never distrusted Richard specifically. He barely knew him, in fact, when he first drafted the clause. He wrote that he had, instead, spent 30 years in business watching good, trusting people, men and women both, get quietly taken advantage of by people who love them, and that he had made a promise to himself, long before I ever brought Richard home for the first time, that whoever I loved, whoever I built a family with, my inheritance would never be a door someone could walk through without my full, deliberate, undeniable consent. If you're reading this, the letter ended, it means someone tried, and it means it didn't work. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, whoever you married. But I am not sorry I built this. I built it for exactly this Tuesday morning, whenever it came. I love you. Go build something better with what's left. I have that letter framed now in my new home, next to a photograph of my father at my wedding, crying despite insisting beforehand that he didn't do that sort of thing. He was right about that too, in the end. He didn't do that sort of thing. Except, apparently, when it mattered most.